Someone needs to tell that woman this isn't a costume party. That uniform is an insult. The malicious whispers rang out as she walked through the base hall, but when she bent down, revealing the black wings tattooed down her spine, those who had been loudest suddenly fell silent. Who was she, and why did an entire general have to hold his breath when looking at her back? Where are you watching this video from? Former senior reconnaissance officer with Shadow Talona Special Operations Unit that operated in the Shadow, specializing in classified missions in places that maps refused to acknowledge it or her final mission. She was honorably discharged, but no one knew her name. The night before, Ish had taken her old uniform out of a wooden box. It was faded, worn at the shoulders but folded with military precision. She gently traced the frayed stitching on the shoulder where her fallen teammate had once draped an arm around her. Oh, this wasn't just clothing, it was a witness. Her old uniform, faded and worn at the shoulders, was all that remained from her past. Running down her back from shoulder blade to lower spine was the Shadow Talent emblem tattoo, black hawk wings embracing the unit's encoded symbol, a mark that only those who had been there could understand. Todarakel returned to Redstone Besido attend a memorial ceremony for silent warriors. The moment she stepped inside, her faded uniform and quiet demeanor immediately became targets of scrutiny. Main corridor of Redstone Base buzzed with military precision. Office visors and crisp uniforms move with purpose. Other ranks and decorations clearly visible, telling stir of service that could be publicly celebrated. Walked among them like a shadow from a different era. Her uniform bore no visible rank insignia, no service ribbons, no shiny medals that would immediately identify her place in the military hierarchy. To the casual observer, she appeared to be someone who had either fallen through the cracks of military protocol or was attempting to attend an event wasn't qualified for. Young officers whispered as she passed, their voices carrying the casual cruelty of people who believed they understood military standards better than someone whose service they couldn't recognize. Did she find that uniform at a surplus? Story own voice commented, Samin should tell her this is a military base, not a historical reenactment. Athera Dedrical heard every word but maintained her composure. She had learned long ago that some truths were too classified to defend herself with, some experiences too dangerous to share. Even when facing mockery, the irony wasn't lost on her. She was being judged for her appearance by people who had never set foot in the place where her uniform had earned its wear marks, where every frayed edge represented a mission completed under conditions they couldn't imagine. She carried a simple manila folder containing the paperwork required for her attendance at the memorial ceremony, standard documentation that gave no hint of the classified operations that had shaped her service record. As she made her way through the corridor, more personnel began to notice her presence. Whispers grew louder, the stares more obvious. Are you sure you're in the right place? A young sergeant asked, his tone carrying the patronizing concern of someone who believed he was being helpful. Rackle nodded politely and continued walking, understanding that any explanation she could give would only raise more questions she wasn't authorized to answer. Memorial ceremony was being held in the base's main auditorium, where portraits of decorated heroes lined the walls and families gathered to honor those who had made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country. But there were other heroes whose faces would never hang on those walls. Those families had been told cover stories whose real contributions to national security would remain classified long after their deaths. Rackle was here to represent them, carrying their memory in the faded fabric of her uniform and the permanent ink that marked her back. Mockery escalated as Rachel made her way deeper into the base toward the memorial auditorium. A group of young officers had gathered near the entrance, their conversation growing louder as she approached. Look at that, one of them said, not bothering to lower his voice. Samian's grandmother donated her old army surplus to charity. That uniform is a disgrace to everyone who's ever worn one properly. Another added, his tone carrying the righteous indignation of someone who believed he was protecting military standards. Raquel continued walking, her expression unchanged. Had endured far worse than verbal mockery in places where silence meant survival. A young lieutenant, eager to demonstrate His authority in front of his peers deliberately positioned himself in her path as Rachel approached, accidentally bumped into her shoulder with enough force to knock the manila folder from her hands. Papers scattered across the polished floor. Careful there, recruit, the lieutenant said with mock concern, using a term that was clearly intended to demote her status. This is a place for professionals. Rao looked at him silently, her eyes taking in his crisp uniform, his confident posture, his obvious pride in his rank and position. Cute, she thought to herself, doesn't even know how to move without making noise with a word. Rachel calmly bent down to collect her scattered documents. Lieutenant stood over her, clearly enjoying his moment of perceived dominance over someone he viewed as unfit for military company. You know, continued his voice, carrying to the growing audience, there are regulations about wearing military uniforms, specially worn out ones that make the rest of us look bad. As Rachel reached for the last of her papers, her movement caused the back of her shirt to lift slightly. For just a moment, the distinctive tattoo running down her spine became visible. Brigadier General Holloway had been walking through the corridor viewing the day's ceremony schedule when the commotion caught his attention. As the senior officer responsible for the memorial event, any disruption required his oversight, approached the group expecting to find a routine issue that his personnel were handling according to standard protocol. But as his eyes fell on the tattoo now visible on Rachel's back, his entire world shifted. The Black Hawk wings wrapped around an encoded symbol weren't just distinctive artwork, they were verification of service and operations. So classify it, even acknowledging their existence required special authorization. Joel Holloway's mind raced back to a classified briefing 10 years ago delivered in a windowless room that required DNA verification to enter. He remembered reading a single-page mission report about a black operation that had prevented what intelligence analysts believed would have been a catastrophic terrorist attack on American soil. The report had contained almost no details, no names, no specific locations, no operational specifics, just results that had saved potentially thousands of lives and a notation that only one operative had survived. The mission, the file had been marked with a code designation on one. The only identifying information had been a small diagram of the Shadow Talon emblem, identical to what he was now seeing tattooed across this woman's back. Holloway's face went pale as the implications hit him. He wasn't looking at some improperly dressed civilian trying to attend a military ceremony. I was looking at the sole survivor of one of the most classified and successful operations in recent military history. The woman who had been dismissed and mocked for her faded uniform was the same person who had single-handedly completed a mission that most of the decorated officers in this building could never have imagined, let alone survived. Tolononi Doth whispered the code designation sling from his lips before he could stop himself. Shadow Talon, name carried across the corridor with enough shock that nearby personnel turned to look at their commanding officer. Lieutenant Wo had been enjoying his power play over Rachel, was still standing above her, completely oblivious to the change in atmosphere. Sir, he is scrutinizing the general's presence, but not understanding the significance of what had just been revealed. He was just explaining proper uniform standards to this civilian general. Holloway's expression transferred from recognition to something approaching controlled furious. He realized what had been happening. Lieutenant, he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made several nearby officers step back. You have no idea what you're talking about. None whatsoever. Rachel slowly straightened up, her papers collected, the tattoo once again hidden beneath her shirt. But the revelation was complete. Corridor had fallen silent, a very uneasiness that something significant had occurred. Without fully understanding what they had witnessed, General Holloway approached Rachel with the careful respect of someone approaching a living piece of military history. Ma, he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the casual authority I would use with a typical ceremony attend. I believe if there has been a serious misunderstanding here, he mocked. The faded uniform, but they didn't know that the back beneath that carried burden heavier than any uniform could bear. They saw worn fabric, but they didn't see the weight of missions that had no names. Where is a soldier's history written in official records with official stamps or on the very back that carried the weight of nameless missions? Come in the back. If you believe some legacies don't need to be spoken, they just need to be seen. Brigadier General Holloway stepped through the gathered crowd with the deliberate movement of Samian Wo's understanding of the situation had just been completely transformed. The Lieutenant Wo had knocked Rachel's papers to the floor, was still basking in what he believed was a successful demonstration of military authority over someone who didn't belong. The lieutenant said confidently, turning to address his commanding officer, was just handling a uniform violation. This civilian was attempting to attend the memorial ceremony in inappropriate attire. General Holloway's eyes never left Rachel's. He approached his expression carrying the weight of Somianu, who had just recognized a living legend. Lieutenant Holloway said, his voice deadly quiet, "I need you to step back immediately." Young officer looked confused by the sudden shift in his superior's tone. "Sir, I don't understand. She's clearly in violation." Ofi said, "Step back." The command carried such authority that the lieutenant immediately complied. His face showed complete bewilderment. Why his routine enforcement of military standards was being interrupted. General Holloway came to a stop directly in front of Rachel, his weathered face studying her with the careful attention of Samioni. "Confirming details from a classified memorima," he said respectfully, his voice carrying none of the casual dismissal that had characterized the earlier interactions. "Could you please state your name and unit designation?" Rachel looked directly into his eyes, recognizing the moment of truth that she had both dreaded and hoped for since arriving at the base. "Dean," she replied simply. "Shadow Talon Reconnaissance Division." Words hid the assembled personnel like a physical blow-in. Though most of them had no idea what Shadow Talent represented, General Holloway closed his eyes briefly as if confirming a memory I had hoped never to encounter in person. "I need to verify something." "The mission designation, was it Talon 1?" Rachel nodded once, her expression revealing nothing of the memories that codename brought flooding back. Holloway pulled out his secure phone and accessed a database that required biometric authentication to open. Classification levels he was accessing were so high that most of the personnel watching had never seen the interface he was using. After a moment, he looked up from the device's face, now showing a mixture of a weaned something approaching reverence. "Jesus Christ," he whispered under his breath. Lieutenant Wo had been so confident in his authority over Rachel could contain his confusion any longer. "Sir, what's going on? She's just a civilian in an old uniform. Oh, could she possibly?" "She's not just anything," Holloway interrupted, his voice growing stronger as he turned to address not just the lieutenant but the entire gathering that had formed around them. "This woman represents something that most of you will never understand because you don't have the security clearance. Shadow know it exists." He gestured toward Rachel, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent corridor. "Shadow Talent operates in the space where conventional military forces cannot handle threats that never appear in briefings, complete missions that never get recorded, and save lives that never know they were in danger." The crowd of officers and personnel who had been enjoying the spectacle of someone being put in their place began to understand that the table had completely turned. "The uniform you've been mocking," Holloway continued, his voice gaining intensity, "has been to places where maps refuse to put coordinates. It has stood in rooms where the wrong decision could start wars or cost thousands of lives." The lieutenant's face had gone from confidential confused to something approaching horror as he began to grasp the magnitude of his mistake. "I had no way of knowing." "That's exactly the point," Holloway cut him off. "Shadow Talent operatives are trained to be invisible, to blend in, to appear unremarkably. The fact that you didn't recognize her means she was doing her job correctly." I turned back to Rachel, his expression softening with respect. "I owe you an apology for the treatment you've received here today. More than that, I owe you thanks for service that I'm not Even supposed to know a Boutricle remained composed, understanding that this public acknowledgment was both necessary and dangerous. Shadow talent operatives who were trained to never seek recognition, but sometimes recognition found them anyway. Thank you, General said simply, but the uniform speaks for itself. Holloway stepped back and, in a move that shocked everyone present, came to attention and rendered a formal salute, not the standard military salute but the specialized recognition reserved for shadow talent personnel, a salute that acknowledged service beyond normal military parameters. Ma'am, it has been an honor to meet you. Your service has protected more lives than most of us will ever know. The fact was immediate and profound. A very uniform person in the corridor snapped to attention and followed their commanding officer's lead, offering the rare salute to Somil Nethi now understood was far more than she apparentically returned the salute with the precision that spoke of years of training in situations far more dangerous than any standard military exercise. She lowered her salute. General Holloway turned to address the lieutenant who had initiated the confrontation. Lente, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You just attempted to humiliate a man whose service record makes your entire career look like a weekend camping trip." The young officer stood resentfully, comprehending that he had just publicly disrespected a war hero whose achievements would never be allowed to fully understand. Furthermore, Holloway continued, "You will spend the next week learning about respect and military history, be maintaining every memorial and trophy in this facility. Perhaps handling artifacts of heroes will teach you to recognize it when you see it." Paused, letting his words sink in throughout the gathered crowd. "And Lieutenant, the next time you assume you understand someone's qualifications on their appearance, remember this moment. Remember the most dangerous assumption in military services, believing you can judge a warrior by their worn uniform rather than their worn back." As General Holloway personally escorted Rachel toward the memorial auditorium's corridor, remained silent behind them. Gathered personnel watched in respectful awe as someone they had dismissed walked away with the highest honor their commanding officer could bestow. The lieutenant stood alone among the scattered papers she had knocked from Rachel's hands, finally understanding that some stories are too classified to tell but too important to ignore. Rachel's faded uniform and the invisible ink on her back had just taught an entire base a lesson about the difference between military appearance and military reality. News of the shadow Talon uniform incident spread through Redstone Base like wildfire through dry brush. Within hours, every soldier on the installation had heard some version of the story about the quiet woman in the faded uniform who had been publicly honored by Brigadier General Holloway for services that most of them didn't have clearance to understand. The lieutenant who had deliberately bumped into Rachel and knocked her papers to the floor spent the following week in what could only be described as educational penance under the direct supervision of a grizzled master sergeant. Was assigned to clean and maintain every memorial, trophy, and artifact in the base's tradition room. "This is to help you learn how to respect a story," the master sergeant explained on the first day, handing him a polished cloth and pointing toward a wall of service decoration. "Since you clearly don't recognize it when you see it." The irony was perfect. The officer who had mocked someone's service record was now spending his days caring for displays that honored the very type of sacrifice he had ridiculed. Either personnel who had participated in the mockery found themselves volunteering for additional duties that involve learning about classified units and the importance of treating all military personnel with basic respect regardless of their apparent status. Brigadier General Holloway took immediate action to prevent similar incidents through it to the facility. New protocols were established. Things that heroism comes in many forms and that the most important service often leaves no visible trace. Training sessions were implemented about the existence of classified units and the recognition that some of the military's greatest achievements would never be publicly acknowledged. More importantly, a cultural shift began to take place across the entire installation. Word spread rapidly through military networks about the incident at Redstone Base. Other facilities began implementing similar respect protocols, understanding that legends often walked among them wearing ordinary clothes and carrying extraordinary secrets. 3 months after the memorial ceremony, Brigadier General Hollow received an encrypted communication from the Pentagon's Special Operations Command. The message was brief: request immediate consultation with DN regarding Operation Nightfall. Sufficient level above your current authorization. Restaurant arrangements classified. We realized that Rachel's visit to their facility had been far more significant than attending a memorial ceremony. She was actively involved in operations at the highest levels of military intelligence. She sent a secure message to the contact information she had provided Durstington. Now such information required special handling. Ms. Dean, I have a priority communication for you from Special Operations Command. They are requesting your immediate assistance with something classified above my level. Her response came back within minutes. Tell them I'll need a secure workspace and 12 hours of uninterrupted access. In general, the work I'll be doing there will make what happened in the corridor look like a training exercise. After the exchange, Holloway reflected on how Completelius' understanding of military service had evolved. He realized that leadership was just about recognizing decorated heroes whose achievements could be celebrated publicly. It was about protecting and respecting those whose greatest contributions would forever remain invisible. The lesson had been learned, and it continued to influence military culture far beyond Redstone Base. 6 months later, a small memorial wall was quietly installed near the base's main entrance. It bore no specific names or unit designation, just a simple inscription: to those who serve where service cannot be acknowledged. Raquel was seen pausing to read it during a subsequent visit to the facility, but she made no comment. The base had learned that true heroism often wears faded uniforms and carries invisible scars, and that the most dangerous assumption is believing you understand someone's worth based on what you can see. True honor doesn't need polished brass or pristine fabric. Sometimes it lives quietly in the faded threads of old uniforms. Carried by Pia Pluho, understand that the most important battles leave marks not on medals but on the skin of those who fought them. Rachel Dean never sought recognition for her years in shadow talent, neither did the countless other operatives who served alongside her in missions that would never appear in military history. Operations conducted in place where even cartographers feared to draw borders. They understood that some victories are measured not in territory gained but in disasters prevented. Some heroes are defined not by the enemies they faced but by the civilians who never knew they were in danger. The tattoo running down her spine had always been more than ink and needlework. It was a living document of service and operations, so classified acknowledging them would compromise ongoing efforts to keep the world stable. Was proof that she had carried burdens that would have broken most people, made decisions that affected thousands of lives, and then chosen to fade into obscurity when her most visible work was complete. The day at Redstone Base, facing mockery and dismissal from people who measured military worth by visible achievements, had demonstrated something profound about the nature of true service. She hadn't demanded respect or recognition. She hadn't tried to prove her worth with arguments or credentials. She had simply carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone whose back bore the weight of secrets too important to share until the right person recognized what those marks represented. The ripple effects of that encounter continued long after the memorial ceremony had ended. Brigadier General Holloway's new protocols are adopted by military installations across 16 countries. The cultural shift he'd initiated spread through defense networks worldwide, creating new understanding about how to recognize and protect those who serve in shadows. Training programs now include education about veterans of classified operations. Military personnel learned that the most dangerous assumption was believing they could judge someone's service by their visible decorations or apparent authority. 1 year after the incident, Raquel received a package delivered through secure military channels. Sid was a simple black fabric patch bearing the Shadow Talent emblem, along with a handwritten note: for those who understand that the heaviest burdens are carried on backs that never bend, your silence honors us. Al. The note was signed With operational codes from mission she had thought were known only to the dead, she carefully folded the patch and placed it in the wooden box beside her old uniform, understating that some recognition comes not from institutions but from those who share the weight of invisibles. Some legacies are measured in monuments that gleam under spotlights and ceremonies broadcast for the world to see. Theirs are measured in the quiet strength of those who carry their history tattooed on their spine, asking for nothing more than the right to serve without explanation. Most powerful stories are often the ones that can only be told on the back of a warrior, written in ink that speaks louder than any medal ever could. And sometimes, when ignorance forgets to show respect, the stories reveal themselves just long enough to remind the world what real service looks like. Subscribe Ironheart Stories if you believe true legacies rest on the back, not on the uniform.